This is a stock 2000 Dodge Viper GTS, and even though it's powered by a massive 8-liter V10 that produces over 450 horsepower, these second-gen Vipers are disappointingly quiet. At idle, they don't sound much different than a vacuum cleaner, and under heavy acceleration, they barely muster a rumble worthy of a V10. The exhaust on this car just doesn't match its aggressive styling and low-slung stance, and it's certainly not what you'd expect out of 488 cubic inches of American muscle. But that's all about to change, because in this video we're going to install a full exhaust system that will dramatically change the sound of this Viper. We're also going to optimize the Viper's tune and measure its output on a dyno to find out how much horsepower and torque the Viper gained from its new exhaust setup. Then we'll race a Shelby GT350 to see how this old Viper stacks up against the most powerful, naturally aspirated engine Ford has ever put into a production car. The exhaust system we're installing today is a bit unique in that it's made up of parts from two different companies. Up front, we have Bellinger's 1 3/4 equal-length headers that are made out of a ceramic-coated aluminized steel alloy. Beyond the standard advantages of long-tube headers, these headers are specially designed to create a Venturi effect that evacuates exhaust gases more quickly. And the ceramic coating will reduce engine bay temps by keeping more of the heat inside the manifolds. We'll also be using a pair of high-flow catalytic converters to further reduce restriction. The rest of the parts are from Billy Boat Exhaust, and what's special about this section of the exhaust system is that it has an X-pipe. This will help the Viper's engine balance exhaust pressures across its two banks, which will not only change the sound of the exhaust, but allow the engine to produce more power. We begin the process of removing the stock exhaust system by taking off the valve covers and the heat shields covering the stock manifolds. Then we can remove the bolts holding the manifolds to the cylinder heads and raise the car so we can access the V-clamps connecting the manifolds to the catalytic converters. I had to bash mine loose with an extension and a hammer, but once the clamps are off, the manifolds are actually pretty easy to remove. Next, we remove the passenger side rocker panel to gain access to that side's catalytic converter and resonator. First, we loosen the front and rear brackets, and then the rusty old C-clamp that holds the cat and resonator together. It took me about the length of a Friends episode to separate them.
It's what the Japanese call unagi.
Next, we loosen up the muffler bracket and its clamps so we can remove the resonator. After repeating this process on the other side and removing the muffler, I weighed all the stock exhaust parts and the total came out to 101 pounds. Then I did the same with the new parts and those came in at 89 pounds. The first step to installing our new exhaust system is to hold one of the header gaskets in place with 3 of the provided bolts. One really cool thing about these headers from Bellinger is that they're actually 2 separate pieces. This makes getting them onto the engine surprisingly easy. Once we finish bolting the header up, it's time to attach the Y collector. But first we apply some copper RTV on its flange to prevent exhaust leaks. Then we bolt it up. The next piece of the puzzle is an elbow with a 3-bolt flange that we also apply some copper RTV to. Once the elbow is in place, we can test fit the catalytic converter, reducer, and resonator. In my case, the hangers on the resonator extended about 3/4 of an inch beyond the bracket holes, so I used an angle grinder to shorten the reducer by about an inch. Then I reassembled the cat, reducer, and resonator, and the hangers lined up perfectly. Now we can install the X-pipe, connect it to the resonator, and install the downstream O2 sensor. After repeating this process on the other side, we finish things up by tightening all the clamps, reinstalling the valve covers, HVAC components, airbox, and the rear wheels. We're going to leave the rocker panels off for now so we can easily check for exhaust leaks and make any adjustments as needed. Now before we do some proper rips with this new exhaust setup, we're first going to dial in the Viper's tune at Street to Sand Off-Road in Reno, Nevada. The owner, Dustin, has tuned well over 1,000 cars, from Camaros to Ferraris, all kinds of off-road vehicles, and my Mustang multiple times. The first step in this process is to add another bung near one of the headers so we can hook up a wideband sensor to monitor the air-fuel ratio while tuning. This is a more accurate approach than using a tailpipe sniffer like we did in the previous tuning video. And for those of you that watched that video, the Viper's tune has been reverted to stock for this video. So the first run we'll be doing is the stock tune with the new exhaust system. The Viper was able to put down 420 wheel horsepower and 447 pound-foot of torque. Now this is only about 10 horsepower more than the Viper's baseline and just goes to show that throwing parts at your vehicle without retuning it often yields suboptimal results. In our case, the Viper's running way too rich. The air-fuel ratio actually dropped to 10.3 in the mid-range. So we cut fuel by 5% across the entire RPM range and took out 3 degrees of timing at the top end just in case we're leaning out the engine too much. Our initial tuning adjustments enabled the Viper to make 428 wheel horsepower and 470 pound-foot of torque, which is a respectable jump. The AFRs did run slightly lean this time, so we increased fuel by 1% in those spots and added back the 3 degrees of timing we took out in the previous tune. This time the Viper put down 447 wheel horsepower and 492 pound-foot of torque, which is the most this car has ever made. So we decided to push it by adding another 2 degrees of timing for a total of 33 around 4,500 RPM. Our timing advances only resulted in a couple more horsepower for a total of 449, and the torque curve was pretty much the same as the last run. When you keep adding timing to a naturally aspirated engine while keeping the AFRs in the mid to high 12s, and that engine stops making more power, you've essentially reached that engine's limit. And while these numbers are about a 9% increase over stock, I have to admit I'm just not that happy with them. I'm also not super stoked on how muted the exhaust still is. While it's nice that the Viper doesn't sound like a bathroom fan anymore, in my opinion, it just sounds like how it should have come from the factory. So I asked David at Street to Sand to cut the resonators off to not only make the exhaust louder, but to hopefully free up some extra horsepower as well. And here's how the Viper sounds now. With the resonators off, the Viper put down 458 wheel horsepower and 505 pound-foot of torque, and while that's only about a 12% bump in peak power, the key takeaway here is the area between the curves. The Viper makes more horsepower and torque everywhere, especially in the mid-range where it maintains 500 wheel torque across 700 RPM. But now it's time to see how this Viper stacks up against a stock 2017 Shelby GT350 with a 5.2-liter Voodoo V8. This feat of Ford engineering revs to over 8,200 RPM. Generates 526 horsepower at the crank. Now some of you may be asking, why this car and not a Corvette? Well, I've put the word out multiple times on social media and reached out to friends trying to find a willing Corvette owner, but for whatever reason, I haven't been able to find any takers. So huge thank you to Lucio for volunteering his gorgeous GT350 for today's race. Lucio also has a YouTube channel of his own called Cars and Kilos where he works on and races his GT350 against the likes of Scat Packs, Mustangs, and BMWs. You should check it out. Now what's interesting about this matchup is that the GT350 actually makes a little more horsepower to the wheels than the Viper, but has significantly less torque. And while the Viper hits peak power around 5,400 RPM, the Shelby doesn't until the mid-7,000s. So here we have two high-performance vehicles that make roughly the same peak power, but one's a torquey, low-revving beast and the other's a high-revving, wailing Chewbacca. The Shelby initially starts to pull ahead, but once the Viper's roaring V10 builds some momentum, it's able to slowly pull away from its fellow snake. For the next race, we're going to bump our starting speed from 20 to 30 miles per hour in an attempt to put the Shelby closer to its power band. Starting at 30 seems to have helped the Viper more than the Shelby, so now we're going to try a 60 roll in second gear to see if that changes the outcome. What was setting up to be a great race was abruptly cut short when I shifted into third and the Viper suddenly lost all power. I was unable to give the Viper any throttle and could feel that the accelerator pedal had fallen flat to the floor. Upon inspection of the pedal, I found that the throttle cable had a ton of slack in it. And at this point, I'm really starting to sweat bullets because 1, it's 90 degrees outside, and 2, we're almost 100 miles away from home in the middle of nowhere and the Viper's undrivable. After about half an hour of messing with it, I was able to jerry-rig a temporary fix that was just good enough to get me home. Big shout out to Lucio for coming out to race and being a good sport about this whole ordeal. Hopefully we can run this race back after I patch up the Viper. And as always, a huge thank you to Dustin at Street to Sand for allowing me to hang out, record, and ask a bunch of questions during the tuning process.